Dear all, we are going to start the program right now. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all invitees and attendees, both present in person and attending virtually. We are live right now in the Senate Room of University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka, and I'm Ushenya Pires. I will be your MC for the program today. The Serendipity Knowledge Program is an ADB platform dedicated to identifying knowledge solutions for Sri Lanka's development challenges. ADB established this new knowledge program in 2021 in line with its vision as a knowledge solutions bank. Today's program focuses on investing in natural capital to achieve sustainability and climate resilience in Sri Lanka. The program consists of panel discussions, presentations, question and answer sessions as we seek to deep dive into identifying key natural assets that require further investments in Sri Lanka. The event will conclude with identifying priority actions to support future efforts in natural capital assessment and investments in Sri Lanka. As this is a hybrid event and will be attended by both virtual and in-person attendees. In the interest of time, we have set up a digital form where you can post your questions during the Q&A sessions. For in-person participants, there is a QR code which you could have received during registration to enable you to access the form. For the virtual participants, we will be posting the link to the form to submit your questions on the Zoom platform. Without further ado, to start off today's proceedings, I would like to call upon Mr. Kenichi Yokoyama, Director General, South Asia Department of the ADB, to welcome address.
I hope you can hear me. So, good morning, Secretary to the Ministry of Environment, Director General of National Planning Department, Vice Chancellor of the University of Peradeniya, eminent speakers and panelists, distinguished guests and colleagues. I'm very honored to address you with welcome remarks at this very important event. The term natural capital is actually very close to my heart. I worked as irrigation and water resources engineer and engaged in many projects, irrigation projects in Asia. There's indeed, we know that there is a interconnectedness between irrigation systems and hydrometeorological systems, watershed, river systems, floodplains, groundwater systems, and so on. We know investments in irrigation infrastructure can become reduced to monuments if the upstream water catchment is destroyed, or the downstream flood drain is filled, or if the groundwater table turns saline. Too often, we tend to assume that ecosystem like watersheds will continue to provide essential services forever. However, we live in times of extreme climate variability. Even sophisticated models may not be able to accurately predict what is in store. In such times, our natural capital is the most effective form of protection and insurance against future calamities. It is far more effective than any financial insurance policy that we may have. So investing in natural capital, the theme of this Serendipity Knowledge event, is very appropriate and relevant for Sri Lanka. As we know, Sri Lanka has achieved high standards of human development, as evidenced by high human development indicators, such as literacy, life expectancy, infant mortality, and so on. This was possible because Sri Lanka invested heavily, consistently, and continuously in building its human capital through good healthcare and education systems. Similarly, Sri Lanka needs to invest in maintaining and enhancing in natural capital stock so that these stocks will help protect the country of future adversities. The Asian tsunami of 2004 was a good example of how people and assets were protected, where they were buffered by natural capital such as mangroves and coastal reefs, coral reefs. This destruction in areas that were not protected by such natural capital was much, much more. Studies have shown that the return on investing in protection of coral reefs, for instance, far outweighs the cost of rebuilding lives and assets destroyed by events such as tsunamis or cyclones. So in this environment, ADB now recognizes the critical importance of supporting our developing member countries to promote invest in natural capital. ADB is now launching our new operating model, which will come into effect in July next month. Under this model, ADB has created a new division, really focusing on natural capital and climate under a sector of agriculture, food, nature, and rural development. We are working on a natural capital approach paper, which will lay out blueprint of how ADB can support countries to enhance their natural capital. ADB support will be available in the form of knowledge and capacity development, as well as funding for investments in pilots and scaling up of existing good practices. I'm very glad to announce that Sri Lanka was selected as a priority pilot country to implement some of these approaches. And this knowledge event is in fact an output of such initial assessments and capacity building work that ADB has supported already in Sri Lanka. So our expectation is that this SKOP event will generate new ideas and renewed interest in opportunities to enhance Sri Lanka's natural capital. ADB is willing and ready to support the country to pursue such opportunities, and we really wish to identify the specific activities, programs, and projects that our Sri Lanka team can work with our HQ new natural capital unit. So I wish this forum to discuss those important aspects, and I wish you all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ikema, for your informative address. Next up, it is my honor to invite on stage Professor M.D. Lamavansha, Vice Chancellor, University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka, to give the opening remarks.
A very good day to one and all. To deliberate on a timely theme related to natural capital, a galaxy of distinguished people have joined us this morning, both physically and via an online platform. They include Dr. Anil Jayasinghe, Secretary, Minister of Environment, Kenichi Yokoyama, who just spoke to us, Director General South Asia Development from ADB. We have got Narayan Iyer representing ADB, Lili Song, Andreas Thurman, and Utsa Kumar, who is representing the Colombo office, Sanath Ranavana, National Water Resource Specialist, ADB, and several other representatives of ADB. And there are others representing both national and international organizations. From Stanford, we have Rafael Chemik, and of course, Mr. Anuruddha Kumarasiri, Director General of National Planning in Colombo, and specialists from my university and other universities, and an enthusiastic group of distinguished guests and participants. I welcome all of you to the University of Peradeniya to enjoy this salubrious environment while deliberating on this timely topic. The university is indeed pleased and honored to partner with ADB in organizing this conference, for which the ADB team has gone into minute details of planning, and they made several visits to University of Peradeniya. I thank ADB for trusting us, and also, of course, Professor Buddhi Marambe and his team for coordinating on behalf of the university. ADB and universities in particular, Peradeniya has been working in many different areas. This is yet another very good initiative, as I can see. Sri Lanka is proud of its long history of conservation, integrated planning and management of land use, efficient management of water, such as tank cascade system in the north central province established in ancient times. However, the management of natural resources as a capital has been a challenge for Sri Lanka, and there is a room for improvement in institutional responsibilities, collaboration, minimizing overlapping mandates. Less well coordinated sectoral planning, for example, in agriculture, transport, power, urban development, has led to certain degree of uncontrolled development pressures on the environment, resulting in degrading ecosystems, including part of the ecosystems of University of Peradeniya, which we are trying to revive these days, and diminishing the potential to provide environmental services that are so important for our own existence, and renewable sources for the benefits of the local communities and national economy. Environmental decision-making in Sri Lanka has also been largely focused on mitigating the direct impacts of development projects, sidelining more coordinated and upstream planning of the developmental activities. Jurisdictional controls of the land do not coincide well with natural ecological boundaries, often results in uncoordinated interventions as highlighted, leading to fragmentation of forests, natural habitats, the instances of increasing human-elephant conflicts. Further, community-based models for managing natural resources sustainably are lacking. And also, probably this is the first time in the university setting that we are trying to give a value to the natural resources we have. Generating information and conducting research on natural capital and its sustainability, both of which are core functions of higher education institutions like Peradeniya and research institutes, are not well coordinated either, thus leaving black holes in the information related to natural capital in our settings. In light of the above background, today's event is of enormous significance. The leading and most comprehensive university of Sri Lanka with international recognition, the University of Peradeniya, has partnered with one of the key development partners of Sri Lanka over the years, the Asian Development Bank, and of course a leading university in the USA, Stanford, to discuss issues related to natural capital management. My university, located in a rich natural capital background, with the longest free-flowing river in Sri Lanka bisecting its land and building complexes, globally known as the Garden University, due to its rich and unique biodiversity with diverse faculties, postgraduate institutes, academic staffs, and more importantly, intelligent undergraduates and the postgraduate students, and educational programs that are related to many aspects of natural capital and its sustainability, has embarked on research in natural capital and its use both in ancient and modern times, for example, irrigation cascade systems in the North Central province. However, these studies have taken place due to the interest of individual academic departments or researchers, but not in a coordinated manner at the central level of the institution. Having understood this, and this conference will certainly lead us to take stock of the research we have undertaken in this field, may not be today, but in coming months, identify lacuna that we have, and develop a coherent plan for the future. Hence, this initiative will not be a one-off event, and I assure ADB for that, but a stepping stone for a long-lasting collaboration with mutual benefits among three great institutions with their focus on a common goal. I invite you to enjoy the university environment and wish you a fruitful day. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Professor. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Lele Song, Director, Economic Analysis and Operational Support Division, ADB, to deliver the keynote address on the importance of investing in natural capital. The stage is yours, sir.
Good morning. Honorable Vice Chancellor of University of Paradenia. Hopefully I can pronounce correctly. I have always difficulties to pronounce all this name. Yeah, Professor Namawasan, and then Honorable Director General of the Sri Lankan Government Planning, and dear esteemed guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's a really great honor for me to join today's event. And thanks to the University of Paradenia for hosting the event. The university campus is truly beautiful and displays a rare aesthetic through the rich foliage, just as your first chancellor said, that no university in the world would have such a setting. So yesterday we spent 2.5 hours wandering through the Royal Botanic Garden and the university campus. It's really, really beautiful. And then this is actually fitting for our discussion today on nature and natural capital. So let me share some of my thoughts on 3 areas today. So one is natural capital in economics. I'm an economist. I would like to point out the problems of economics. And then the human demands on nature and nature's ability to supply. Yeah, economists always talking about demand and supply. And then if we have a problem, what should be done and what multilateral development banks like ADB can help. So first, let me begin with natural capital in economics. For a large part of my professional career as an economist, I had taken nature for granted. So we take an example in economics, one of the most important concept in economics, that's a gross domestic product, GDP. You probably have already heard GDP very much because during the economic crisis, Sri Lanka, you are suffering. Your GDP has declined last year and possibly also declines this year. And GDP is the value of the goods and services a country produces in a year at market price. And usually economists, we would model that GDP in terms of economic production function. Then in this production function, we only have human capital, basically labor augmented by education and health, and produced capital, so-called produced capital, which human produce like machinery, buildings, roads, ports, all these structures. So then we just use those two capital to produce our output. And the nature is missing in this whole production process, production function. Yeah, because it's missing in the basic concept. Then the policy making and economic modeling, we use models to understand how economy operates. Then basically it's also missing, is absent in policy making. So for economists, I think we also we should shoulder the blame. It's only in the past few decades, nature and the natural capital started coming into the mainstream of economics. But yet nature provides goods and services that contribute directly and indirectly to a country's economic output and human well-being. More critically, actually, nature provides some fundamental life supporting functions. Forests, wetlands, coral reef, and other ecosystems provide goods such as food, fuel, and clean water. They also provide culture services and recreational services and spiritual services, spiritual values. And they also provide critical, yet often invisible regulatory and supporting services, such as nutrient cycling, pollination, climate regulation, and protection from nature hazards. And the genetic diversity represented in the planet's living organisms also represents a global public goods because they're providing valuable genetic future options for life in changing conditions. So biodiversity is extremely important, and humanity is part of the nature. We are part of the nature, and natural capital is essential and critical to us. So the role of the nature or natural capital in keeping our societies healthy, increasingly prosperous, and safe from the impacts of global warming has been taken for granted, as I said earlier. We tend to assume that the nature and ecosystems are free. So it's cost nothing to cut forest, to cut trees. You may pay a little bit of transportation costs, so not much to pay the nature. And deplete water costs nothing, and pollute land and the air costs nothing. So now let me turn to the second area I would like to discuss: demand on nature and the supply of the ecosystem of goods and services. Because there's no cost attached to such a extraction from the nature, our demands on nature have been ever growing exponentially. With human demands for ecosystem goods and services are within what nature can provide on a sustainable basis, it's okay, because the nature will recycle and they can regenerate and revitalize then to supply human needs. Probably this was the case a few centuries ago. But in the past 200 years with the Industrial Revolution, our demands on nature has far exceeded the supply. The far exceeded the nature could regenerate and to provide. We take, when the demand outstrips the supply, ecosystem can only provide such a supply with deteriorating itself. So that's a degradation of the nature. So in the past 2 centuries, human society has accumulated a huge wealth of human capital and produced capital, but at the expense of the degradation of the nature capital. And a clear and very urgent issue we see now is climate change or global warming. The atmosphere actually is a sink for our pollutants. We emit carbon emissions into the air, and many ecosystems offer services actually to absorb and sequestering carbon. Yet Driven by social, economic, and industrial growth, our carbon emissions have been so large that the stock of the carbon in the atmosphere, the concentration is so higher than it's lead to the global temperature rise. So this is global warming. And climate change has become the biggest threat to nature and humanity. Global temperature rise is destroying flora at unprecedented rates, and Asia and the Pacific is one of the most biodiverse regions in the world. However, many ecosystems in the region, from tropical forest to coral reef, have already been degraded beyond repair or are at the imminent risk of reaching tipping points. Sri Lanka exhibits a remarkable natural capital, particularly biodiversity, and is among Asia's richest in terms of a species concentration. Despite its relatively small size, it has a wide range of ecosystems, from forest to agriculture, aquatic, and marine environments. However, Sri Lanka's unique biological diversity is facing general decline. So my colleague has provided me some numbers. According to the Convention on Biological Diversity, 27% of 240 identified species of birds are threatened, along with 66% of amphibian species, 56% of mammals, 49% of freshwater fish species, and 59% of reptiles. So all these numbers, actually they are very scary numbers. But despite that, yesterday when we were in the botanic garden, we still hear the huge sound of birds. Yeah, in the morning of the Amaya resort we stayed in the past 3 days. I already here for 3 days. I was lucky. Yeah, I hear so much sound of the birds, but still, yeah, so many, they are disappearing. And furthermore, Sri Lanka's environment is believed to have suffered wide-scale degradation. Watersheds and coastal and marine ecosystems are under threat, and so is groundwater. So now I'll move to my last area to be covered. What should be done? First, I think we need to better understand the status of the nature. We really need to measure natural capital and the value, we need to value it. To value the stock of natural capital and the ecosystem services, goods they provide. If without valuation, human wouldn't take them into account in policy making. So that's economics. And without certain measurement of natural capital, it would be difficult to incorporate natural capital in economic modeling and policy making. We need to change the valuation, pricing, and the risk approach to ensure that ecosystem and biodiversity are accorded with their true worth. They were so high. Only then can we make informed decisions that would increase the global stock of nature capital and the supply of ecosystem goods and services. Some panelists would touch on this topic later. You would hear from them. I just give some on cue. Second, we should try to reduce our demand and increase supply. Yeah, reduce demand is easy said. It's really difficult to do because we rely on all these natural resources the nature can provide us to sustain our human society and human life. But still, we must cut our demands on nature, and particularly early action is required to ensure a global transition to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases, because that's the biggest threat to our humanity. Another is we need to invest in nature and replenish the stock. Yes, this is capital stock. You need to replenish the stock of natural capital. Plant trees, for example, allow nature to recover from assaults that we have been making on them and offer it assistance to regenerate. There are nature-based solutions for regenerating the vitality of ecosystems, such as wetlands or coastal water fisheries, including removing waste, cleaning up rubbish and the plastics. And our colleagues are working on these areas. And and also ADB, we try to do more of this kind of operations. Investing in nature costs money. Any investment would cost money and needs financing. As nature loss and environment degradation reduce economic output because they are essential to economic output, it will become harder for countries to service their debt, leading to a downward spiral of higher debt, poor economic performance, no investment or very little investment in nature, and further degradation in nature capital. So we need to break such a vicious cycle. Even in countries, in Sri Lanka, you have economic difficulties at the moment. So restructuring unsustainable levels of debt is necessary to regain access to financial markets. Some countries have incorporated natural capital in their debt restructuring. And I believe you will hear some examples later today. It's also possible to monetize natural capital through financial markets and mobilize financing for investment in nature. Today, there will be also early examples of utilizing national determined contributions as part of international bond issuance. So there are ways now, there are countries exploring those ways, and we can learn from them. And the multilateral development banks like ADB will help and have a critical role to play in tackling ecosystem degradation and climate change and catalyzing investment in natural capital. MDBs issued a joint nature statement in 2021 at COP27. We committed to further mainstreaming nature into our policies, analysis, assessments, advice, investments, and operations. MDBs have acted to help measure natural capital and value ecosystem goods and services. There are already early attempts to measure natural capital, and the World Bank has done this. They even give a value to the natural capital of Sri Lanka. I look at it. They published in 2021, so they give a value $12,000 for Sri Lanka's natural capital in terms of renewable, both renewable and non-renewable. Very low than many other countries. And I don't think that the value put a true wealth of Sri Lanka per capita, because you look at Kandy, such a wealth natural capital, the value is really higher. And so, yeah, I lost myself. Yeah, but that's fine. And MDBs also support nature-based solutions and foster and make nature-positive investments in sustainable agriculture, forest, and other nature resource management practices. MDBs can also provide technical assistance to support the development of sustainable business models and the implementation of best practice in nature resources management. And our collaboration with University of Panadilla would be one part of this kind of assistance to our member countries. So let me conclude. Time is up. Yeah, nature was largely missing in economics and decision-making for too long. As a result, human demands on nature have far exceeded what nature can regenerate and maintain. Urgent action is really needed to reverse the devastating trend, and the nature capital has been taken seriously in recent years. And we need to better understand the status of natural capital, measure the stock of nature capital, and value ecosystem goods and services. Along with other multilateral development banks, ADB strongly supports the emerging development paradigms that place nature at the center of innovative science, policy planning, and decision-making. And working together, we can help ensure that ecosystems are able to thrive and the future generations can enjoy a healthy and sustainable planet. Thank you very much. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Son, for sharing your valuable views and insights. Now for the next event, presentations on global best practices of investments. Several presenters will be joining us virtually, and also we have one pre-recorded presentation. Joining us virtually are Mr. Herman Camille, Head of Sovereign Debt Management Office, Ministry of Economy and Finance, Uruguay; Professor Oyan, Research Center for Eco-Environmental Sciences, Chinese Academy of Sciences, PRC. And also we will share the video presentation by Ms. Beverly Wade, Director, Blue Bond and Finance Permanence Unit, Office of the Prime Minister, Belize, through this session. Let me invite to the head table Mr. Andreas Thurman, Environmental Finance and Partnership Specialist, ADB, who is present here. And to moderate the session, I would like to invite Mr. Narayan Iyer, Senior Natural Resources and Agriculture Specialist, Rural Development and Food Security, Thematic Group, ADB.
Am I audible? Am I audible? Yeah, thank you. So thanks once again to you all for assembling here to listen to what sometimes seems like an esoteric topic, but at other times, like my friend Lele mentioned, you see nature all around you and it hits you in the face. So in that sense, we are trying to combine in the discussions here today something that seems esoteric, but something that is also touching our daily lives, and which also has, severe existential implications in the long term for all of us. We have several sessions today. We have already had a very robust beginning. Lelis has set the tone very well with highlighting so many issues, and he is also given us a nice segue to get into this panel discussion when he mentioned about learning from global best practices in a part of his speech. So that's what we are trying to do in this panel. Practices within investing in nature are still evolving. And as Lele pointed out, economists never considered nature as something that has any value. It was taken for granted. And it's not just economists. I think business, corporates, most of us did that. Banks, and we are just now realizing how wrong we were. So practices are still evolving, and it is very, very useful for all of us to learn from practices the best practices that are evolving in other parts of the world. So today we have, and we are very thankful to them for joining us virtually from almost the other part of the world, whom I will invite, in succession to share with us their insights. Just one very simple ground rule here. Each panelist has about 10 to 12 minutes to speak. If you are, very crisp, that's great. We'll have a little more time for questions. And at the end of all the 4 panelists' contributions, if we have some time, which I expect we would, we can take some questions. So that's all very simple ground rules. May I invite Dr. Herman Camille from Uruguay, as he was already introduced. He's the head of the Sovereign Debt Management Office in the Ministry of Economy and Finance. And Uruguay has, kind of created history last year when they issued a first sustainability-linked sovereign bond. Not only that, they have also attempted, among many other firsts, to link the climate and environmental goals of the country with conditions in the bond. So without much ado, may I invite Dr. Kamal. Dr. Kamal, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sana, and thank you for the invitation to this event and to share the experience of Uruguay. So indeed, as a way of introduction, in October 2022, Uruguay issued a sustainability-linked bond, and that marked our entry into the world of sovereign sustainable finance. And as you pointed out, the bond directly links Uruguay's financing strategy and its cost of capital to the achievements of climate and nature-based goals that were committed by the country under the Paris Agreement. The sustainability-linked bond embeds two key performance indicators, which are known as KPIs. The first one is reducing the intensity of greenhouse gas emissions in the economy. And the second KPI is preserving the area of native forests in the country. So together they address two complementary environmental global public goods. On the one hand, mitigating global warming, and on the second one, preserving a key carbon sink, like it is native forests. So given those KPIs, those two performance indicators, the sustainability targets were based on the goals that we set for 2025 in our national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. So basically, both the KPIs and the SPTs came out directly from our NDC documents. What we did was to mainstream our NDC commitments inside the covenant of a global bond. The bond itself featured an innovative two-way coupon structure. So we will compensate investors if Uruguay fails to meet its environmental commitments via what is called a coupon step-up, that is an increase in the interest rate. Yet Uruguay will be rewarded if we overperform on our environmental targets via a coupon step-down, meaning lowering our borrowing costs. So those are the key features of the SLB that we issued last year. So what was the rationale? In putting together this instrument, we had four goals in mind. The first one, we wanted to signal and reassert the country's commitment and action plan to deliver on our ambitious climate change and sustainability agenda. So we wanted to position the country and raise the profile of our commitments under the Paris Agreement. The second goal we had was to provide investors and the international community with more transparency and more accountability on Uruguay's progress towards its environmental goals and the conservation of natural capital. More and more, as we engage with foreign and local investors, we get more and more questions as to what is the progress of Uruguay across its environmental foundations. So by issuing this bond, we are also providing more information to the market. The third goal we had when we put together this bond was to broaden and to diversify the bond investor base, particularly those ESG dedicated funds. And finally, we also wanted to foster innovation in the sovereign bond markets because we think that we can create, through financial incentives, more encouragement for sustainable policy making in emerging markets. So given the features of the bonds and those goals that we had in mind, in the rest of my remarks, let me share with you and distill some of the key messages and practical lessons that we got from our experience in designing and executing an SLB in a country like Uruguay. So, lessons that we learned. The first one, in designing the bond, it was very important that we selected KPIs, meaning performance indicators, environmental performance indicators, that were core, relevant, and material to the country's sustainability objectives. At the same time, the targets and the timeline that we chose had to be very ambitious. This was crucial to attract demand from investors. So let me focus in particular on the second KPI, which is the protecting native forests. The conservation and the enhancement of native foreign carbon stocks and sustainable forest management has been a key part of Uruguay's environmental strategy for almost 30 years now. The country has made significant investment in the management of its native forests, which are protected by law since 1987 and are subject to tax exemptions. So what we did was to embed a target that said that we had to keep 100% of our native forests by 2025 compared to 2012. So in all effects, it's a zero deforestation commitment. And what we did was to take that zero deforestation commitment and put it inside as a covenant of a global bond. So we gave a lot of value to natural capital because it's now an integral part, as part of the fabric of one of the most visible financial vehicles a country can have, a bond issued globally. And this resonated very strongly with investor accounts, particularly from European investors' accounts that are very much focused on valuing natural capital. Because as you know, the conservation of natural capital and the protection of biodiversity are increasingly important to halt climate change. And we saw this firsthand in the discussions where we participated in person during COP26 and also COP27. So let me say that fortunately, the transaction, the bond issuance, was very well received. We had a low new issue premium and an order book of around 200 investors. So basically what we did in a way was to take a plain vanilla bond, wrap it up into a sustainability linked indicators that had to be ambitious, that had to be robust, and had to be tied to our NDC targets. And by doing that, we were able to garner 3 times oversubscribed buyers. So we think that this financial instrument, this type of financial instrument, if scaled and replicated, could help unlock much greater financial flows to emerging and developing markets, including Sri Lanka, because it could provide access to an expanded set of investors focused on net zero carbon, focused on protecting natural capital assets, by offering a Paris-aligned financial assets that investors will be looking for. So that's our first lesson then, the importance on picking and choosing the KPIs and the SPTs that are relevant for the country and that will be appealing for investors. The second lesson that we got is that in a way, the bond really shows the country's political but also technical resolve to turn its NDC's goals into financially binding commitments. Now, when you do that, the fact that you have an economic consequence to a target you are setting incentivizes policymakers to make those targets a strategic priority. So the fact that we linked the NDC targets to a bond meant in particular that the Ministry of Finance of Uruguay had to pay much more attention and had to get much more involved to make sure that we live up to those stated NDC commitments compared to an otherwise situation where maybe it wouldn't have been so much in the radar. So you're raising the profile, you're having financial consequences to your NDCs, and now it's not only the Minister of Environment, it's not only the productive ministries, but also the Ministry of Finance that is getting involved. The third lesson that we got is that accurate reporting, timely availability, and an external verification of the indicators are key critical components of the bond structure, because in the end, it's what's going to give assurance to investors. Now, in the case of Uruguay, because greenhouse gas emissions involve CO2, methane emissions from cows, and also N2O, and of course, native forests, they span across all sectors of the economy. So we had to work with 4 different other ministries to create an interministerial governance structure that was necessary to design, to execute, and to the report on the SLB. So in particular, we worked to accelerate the reporting of the country's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and we went from reporting every 2 years to reporting every year, meaning with only 1 year lag. And that elevated the Uruguay's GHG reporting practices to be in line with those of countries like the US and Canada. And this was a huge effort on the side of the productive ministries. Additionally, we have used geospatial data and satellite image mapping to estimate the area of native forests in the country in line with international best practices. And coincidentally, today, the 31st of May of 2023, we will be publishing our first annual report on the SLB, providing the updated performance on KPIs on the bond. Now, my point here is
Dr.
that—
Kamal, you have 2 minutes.
2 minutes,
left.
okay. The point here is that the coordination that we got between ministries has helped promote sustainability within the country. The bond is having a galvanizing effect in the public sector, and in my sense is that it will facilitate the continuity of the policies and commitments past this current administration. I think it would have an effect for years to come. The fourth lesson is it's very important to engage investors early on, to test the ideas, to make sure they're part of the journey. So as you may imagine, at the beginning, investors were refusing to accept the idea of a step down because there had been none since the first SLBs were launched in 2019. Now, we were satisfied very much with the reaction of the market, and we think it was a proof of concept for us. Our final lesson is that in our experience, there is a key role to play by multilateral banks and multilateral institutions in designing this kind of financial instruments. We work very closely with the Inter-American Development Bank, and they provided us with support, with technical expertise, with advice on how to engage with the investor base. They really had a key role as a trusted advisor with us. And another innovation of the bond is that we partner with the United Nations Development Program to get from them an independent and external verification process for the KPIs. In closing, beyond the case of Uruguay, which I just described, we are convinced that we can harness financial markets to encourage countries in their climate performance and their protection of natural capital. But we need to create the right incentives, the right financial incentives to do so. And potentially reducing the borrowing costs could provide that powerful incentive for governments to follow through on their pledges and address climate change and also natural capital conservation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kamal, for such an inspiring talk. In fact, I think the number of lessons that you mentioned that are relevant for countries, not only like Sri Lanka, but many others, are so rich in content. I think you'll be bombarded with questions, if not today, over a period of time, and we will try to aggregate them and send it to you.
I'd be glad to answer.
But thank you, and thanks again for staying up at such an unearthly hour to participate.
Okay.
We are really obliged.
A pleasure.
Thank you. And now we move on to a recorded presentation made by Beverly Wade. We are moving back to the same part of the world, but this time to an island nation, Belize. Beverly is the director of Blue Bonds and Project for Finance Permanence. And essentially, she ran the Blue Bond program that Belize issued. In fact, Lele, again, I go back to Lele's speech where he mentioned there will be lessons on restructuring of debt that we would see today, and this is one of them. So this is a presentation by Beverly on Belize's experience in how they restructured debt when they were in a fiscally tight situation. So let's hear Beverly. Can we have the presentation, please?
Good morning. I'd like to first take this opportunity to thank the organizers of the meeting to invite Belize to share with you our experience with the Blue Bond and to be a part of this knowledge sharing event. So my presentation will basically talk to you about our Blue Bonds, why our Blue Bonds, and to discuss a little bit about possible replicability of a Blue Bond agreement, especially in the case of Sri Lanka. So just some general introductory information regarding Belize. We are a small island developing state. We're very small. We're vulnerable, especially to climate change. We're actually ranked 8 in terms of climate risk by the World Bank in 2012, out of 167 countries. And we face the same global threats that developing states face. We are a country that is very much dependent on our natural resources. Agriculture and tourism are our main industries, and actually our natural resources account for approximately 50% of our country's GDP in terms of agriculture, fisheries, forestry, and tourism, and some mining and quarrying. These sectors remain prioritized development sectors as well as prioritized export sectors. And tourism, agriculture, and fisheries, along with aquaculture, account for more than 41% of our GDP and 30% of our labor force in 2015. So Belize is a leader in the conservation and sustainable use of our resources, and we have approximately 60% of our forest cover and 36% of our terrestrial surface area under protection. And we have now 20% of our total ocean space protected. We've made efforts in implementing conservation and protecting biodiversity as the cornerstone of our national economic development, and we promote the sustainable forest management, ecotourism, and the implementation of rights-based approach to our fisheries sector. These actions as a result of economic linkages to biodiversity in Belize. Our blue assets have been estimated to contribute over $500 million to our Belizean economy on an annual basis. And these are through ecosystem services provided by our coral reefs and mangroves in particular. And they are very much critical to our fisheries, tourism, and tourism sector, and also to provide shoreline protection to our state, which is a very low-lying country. So in general, Belize's overall policy is to find that balance between sustainable use of the coastal and marine environment for the benefit of all Belizeans and also for our global community. So why the blue bonds? So back in 2020, the COVID pandemic had a global slowdown, as we all know, but our Belizean economy actually contracted by 16.7%, and our national debt equaled 133% of GDP. This was totally unsustainable. And so one of the priorities of the administration, the government of the day, was to now look at our debt and to now look at what are the possible solutions in terms of moving forward with regards to Belize's debt. So we had this huge commercial debt that was referred to as the super bond, and it was basically categorized as junk bonds. It was trading at approximately 38 to 47 cents on the dollar. And also, besides the economic challenges that Belize had, Belize, like most states, was also challenged with identifying the financing for its conservation, sustainable development, and climate change targets and ambitions. So what the Blue Bond did for Belize was that we successfully negotiated, which at that time was the single largest blue bond debt agreement, and it's now second because some 3 weeks ago, Ecuador successfully negotiated the single largest blue bond of approximately $1 billion. But for us, what it did it reduced our total debt, our total national debt by 12%, and actually reduced our debt to GDP ratio by 25%. It created long-term investment in conservation for 20 years, and it created a conservation trust fund to fund on-the-ground activities by organizations that has access to approximately $4 million annually. It also invested in an endowment fund, which by year 21, since the agreement was signed, would have matured to $90 million. So basically, our blue bond we refer to it as blue finance for ocean protection, and it's really transforming debt into conservation action. And it follows a model where it starts with a government commitment, because government has to be committed to these, to both paying back a new financial transaction, but also in delivering the impact conservation targets that are associated with such a deal. This is very important because this is central to the whole deal at the end of the day. If you don't have that political commitment, then the deal would not be successful. And so it ends up with intense stakeholder engagement, and at the end of the day, conservation, which should result in healthier ocean, improved management, and sustainable economic activities. Process undertaken for our blue bond was that in 2020, we started negotiations between the government of Belize and TNC, and who then approached Credit Suisse, which is a private sector partner in our deal, and a development finance corporation that de-risked the deal and was really important in providing a credit enhancement for the deal, which allowed our junk bonds to really be traded as investment grade bonds. And our transaction was closed in early November. So it was plus or minus about a year in terms of putting this all together. How it really worked, a commercial loan was given to the BBIC, which is the Belize Investment Company Limited, that is a wholly owned TNC subsidiary, and that loan was given to them by Credit Suisse. The BBIC then lends an impact note to the government of Belize that was de-risked by the DFC, and the government used that impact note to purchase its existing sovereign debt at a 45% discount, and also used proceeds from the impact note to now fund conservation targets and commitments. So in terms of the agreement structure, our blue loan has two main agreements associated with it. It has the blue loan and the blue bond, and it has a conservation funding agreement. So I won't go back over the blue loan and the blue bond, because basically I did that in the last slide. But what is more important here is to now look at the conservation funding agreement. And so the conservation funding agreement has government contributing into a conservation fund, which then fund program activities. And these contributions that comes into the conservation fund is done on a quarterly basis by the government of Belize via the BBIC. Key considerations in this deal was some of the innovations that were built in, some of the safeguards. Not only did the deal have political risk insurance, but it also recognized our high exposure to storms and hurricanes, which could have caused an economic slowdown and allow government of Belize to not be able to pay back its loans or to pay back the bondholders. And so parametric insurance was integrated into this deal to safeguard against such a situation. Success, impacts, and recommendations. So the blue bond for us significantly reduced our national debt by over $180 million. It also ended up in a significant debt reduction in debt services of over 200 million over 20 years because of a more favorable interest rate and also more favorable payback schedule. It ended up with funds for marine conservation actions of over 180 million US dollars over the 20 years, an endowment fund that was pre-funded, and also a national conservation funding mechanism was established, and it allowed us to now be in a position to now leverage our success of the Blue Bond into new initiatives for finance permanence. It created credibility for future private sector investments with ambition, and as mentioned before, a tested model which has now been used by several countries in our region. The Barbados Blue Bond that was recently negotiated in September of last year was basically modeled from the Belize Blue Bond, and at the end of the day, it should result in improved management, a healthier ocean, and sustainable economic activities. We believe that this debt conversion structure is highly scalable and replicable for achieving conservation and climate outputs and creating sustainable conservation funding, especially for countries like Sri Lanka that has a very large ocean space, but also has the same kind of natural assets and natural capital that Belize has. Countries committed to achieving their conservation outcomes as the threat of climate change and awareness of the role that natural resources and biodiversity play in economic growth rapidly increase. Most developing countries will require additional financing for conservation, like Belize and like Sri Lanka. Organizations like the DFC or other MDBs can replicate the insurance structure in other countries like Sri Lanka, and other bilateral and multilateral development finance institutions can consider providing similar risk mitigation products, credit guarantees, to do more deals in more markets. While debt conversion work well with sovereign debt trading at a discount in the capital markets, they are not exclusively for countries threatened by high debt distress either. Many countries have high coupon bonds. Even if these trade at little to no discount, they can still refinance with lower coupons and longer tenure to create significant funding for conservation. Many also have commercial bank loans or other liabilities that, while not often traded in the market, have high interest rate and or short tenures that may be candidates for refinancing into a lower interest rate and or longer tenure loans. So in a nutshell, that is a synopsis of our Blue Bonds. As I said, it hinges on some critical factors, and one of them is first a national vision, national commitment to these conservation and sustainable development targets. Two, to have a partner that can help to de-risk these deals, especially for countries like Belize and other developing countries. And three, at the end of the day, it is very much something that is replicable, and it should be country led. It should be tailored by every country, because at the end of the day, those targets that are integrated into your deal should be benefiting your national objectives and your national policies and direction. Thank you. I know that we were unable to virtually be with you during this session, so please feel free to contact my office at the contact details here for any further information. We're here to provide as much information as possible, and we look forward to countries benefiting from our experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beverly. Thanking you in absentia. We overshot time here by, I think, almost 5 minutes. I'm sorry about that, but actually, it's a very difficult subject to do justice to in 12 minutes. And I think Beverly did a fantastic job, so thanks once again. I think there are many messages here, but the key message I felt was that this is a highly replicable and scalable model. And for any questions, as Beverly offered to take them by email, we will also try to answer questions if you have right away as best as we can. So having said that, in the interest of time, I would like to now call upon Professor Ouyang. Professor Ouyang is Director of Research Center, Economic Environmental Sciences in Chinese Academy of Sciences. He is a leading authority on natural capital assessments, accounting, and a pioneer in the gross ecosystem product model. As we've seen, we are looking at global best practices, and this is really cutting edge when it comes to measuring natural capital, valuing it, and using that to direct development. Professor Ouyang, over to you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. It is my great pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to join the events. My topic is mainstream economic services and biodiversity in conservation policy in China. I just give a very short description. In China, President Xi Jinping declared the build ecological civilization in China. The key was harmonizing people and nature. The key issue is how to coordinate conservation and development. So the scientific question is where we must protect to ensure sustainable supply of ecosystem services. And second is how to achieve natural capital conservation and poverty alleviation. And then how to evaluate the development achievements not on GDP. Yeah, for this purpose and to meet the national strategy requirement. So we based on the based on ecosystem services to do such research. Actually, we do the ecosystem assessment, survey assessment all over China and the mapping ecosystem services, and then link ecosystem services with the policy making to inform ecosystem services into policy innovation. For example, key ecological protection line, key ecological function area, ecological compensation policy, and the national park system, and then to ensure ecological security and ecological civilization in China. I just give a little bit detail about this activity in China. First, China ecosystem survey and assessment, the difference at the scale for all the provinces and the regional and the national park, national scale for China. And actually, we do it for every 5 years, 2000, 2005, and 2020. And also, we done a ground survey more than 200 sites all over China. And also, we use the inverse model and other model together. The goal is to build overall image of ecosystem status of China, for example, ecosystem distribution and patterns, ecosystem quality and their change, and ecosystem services and their change. And then identify the crucial area for ecosystem services. And here gives them a little bit of figures about ecosystem composition and part of China. For example, the forestry in China about 20%, and the grassland about 7%. Also, we have the cropland about 20% all over China. That's it. The grassland, forest, cropland, and the desert was made of more than 83% of total area of China. And then, based on the data we get for the ecosystem survey and assessment, we map ecosystem service of China for example, food production where China produces food to feed the people, and the carbon sequestration, soil retention, sandstorm prevention, water retention, flooding mitigation, and the biodiversity conservation is meet habitat provision. And then we combine together to identify the important area for ecosystem services. Actually, this here is the regulating services. And also we analyze the change in service part in China. Where is the change? What services increase, what services decrease. And fortunately, we accept 7 services. On 1 services was declined for the of wildlife habitat provision is declined in last 20 years. And then identified ecosystem and use this information and link services towards making. So identify ecosystem function contribution area for regional development strategy. In China, where area would provide the food, which area provide the natural capital ecosystem services, and where we use for urbanization area. So whole in China totally, we identify 63 ecosystem function conservation area, about 49 of China for water retention, biodiversity conservation, soil retention, sandstorm prevention, and flooding mitigation. And then we based on the services and let's identify ecological protection design for land use management aspects. We provide about 35% of land of China need to protect strictly for the natural capital and the ecosystem services. And then we design ecological financial transfer for ecological composition. In order to push conservation in key ecological function area, central government launched the ecological financial transfer program based on ecosystem service pattern. The budget was increased to 6 actually now with 80 billion yuan in 2022 in China, and more than 700 countries benefit from this financial program. Also, we use analysis ecosystem services pattern to the national park system planning. So China will build the largest national park system in the world, will cover 10% of China. The national park will cover 10% of China area. And we based on the representative ecosystem service, natural capital, wildlife, and ecosystem services to lay out the way we need to build a national park. Yeah, at last, how to evaluate the achievement as beyond GDP. GDP is also very important for the economic development indicate, but we need to indicate for the natural contribution to the people. GDP just means is aggregated value of final goods and services supplied to people into given region annually, such as in China, country, province, or county, and then to use this information to inform the decision making, for example, evaluation government policy and performance, land use and infrastructure planning, and the financial combination for ecosystem service supply, and then to improve the ecosystem production, restoration, compensation, and sustainable management, and then, of course, to increase ecosystem assets. The central government and National Development Reform Commission at the National Bureau of Statistics released a guideline for GDP accounting and applied in all of China. Yeah, here to give a very short conclusion. China has made big efforts to apply ecosystem services evaluation and mapping in conservation policy. And the ecosystem services evaluation can be powerful and useful tools to support conservation policy making and innovation. China is developing GEP accounting for evaluating the effectiveness of ecological compensation, conservation efforts, and to promote harmonized people and nature. Also, we still have another opportunity, like China at the stage of faster urbanization process. So how to introduce ecosystem services, natural capital in the urban sustainability to urban planning and management. Also, China have a long coast area, bigger long coast area. We need how to improve the cultural management based on ecosystem services. But also create development through marketing mechanism for ecosystem services. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yang. And that was indeed, I think words coming from pioneers, which we try to understand and imbibe and try to apply in our context. I think there's a lot of work to be done in this area still, especially in countries outside of China, where we are still considerably lagging behind. But as you pointed out, in one of your slides, the several sources of data and information that you use, some of them which leverage digital technology can actually help countries like Sri Lanka and many others who leapfrog the timeline of evolution in this. And it may also be timely for me to mention here about the natural capital accounting and assessment exercises that we are helping to do, which my friend Rafa from Stanford will be talking about in another session later on, which directly has many uses, and one of them is leading to the GDP system, leading to measuring the value of natural assets. So thanks once again, Professor Yang. Maybe we might have specific questions for you later on. Now, I would like to invite my friend Andreas. He's Environment Finance and Partnership Specialist within Environment Thematic Group in ADB. He's also in charge of ADB's Blue Bond Incubator that was mentioned some time back, a very key element of ADB's Ocean Finance and Health Program. So over to you, Andreas. You have 10 to 12 minutes. Maybe you can take some liberties. But
okay, thank you very much. So as Narayan mentioned, my name is Andreas. Good morning to all of you. And so now better. Okay. And yes, I'm with the Environment Thematic Group of ADB, and my job is to find new financing mechanisms for environmental projects. And I'm mainly based in the Healthy Oceans team of ADB as well, since Oceans and SDG 14 are the most underfunded SDG. That's where most of my work at the moment relies. And so in 2019, ADB made a promise to finance $5 billion of ocean projects. And that's just to show that we are on a good trajectory. So up to now, ADB financed 2.2 billion, and we have a strong pipeline for this year, next year of another 2.7 billion. So that in the end, we should reach the 5 billion that we plan for. And within this Healthy Ocean Action Plan, we actually have 4 key pillars. So I'm leading the work on the ocean and climate finance, but we also have colleagues who work on pollution control, mainly on plastics. We have other colleagues working on sustainable coastal and marine development, and then also on sustainable seafood. And if we look back to 2019, so besides looking for a new and additional project in the ocean sphere, one step in this whole ocean finance topic that ADB found was important to actually also issue our own first blue bonds. And therefore, ADB already had a green bond framework, and we revised this framework to also add blue categories, so to also be able to issue a blue bond. And we got a second party opinion, as was also already mentioned by previous speakers, that that's a good standard to ask an outside agency to look at your bond framework, if it makes sense, if it really helps, in this case, to protect the oceans. And then in September 2021, ADB managed to issue its first 2 blue bonds. They were for $300 million. They were both directly placed with Japanese insurance companies, and one was issued in New Zealand dollars and the other one in Australian dollars. And with these funds, we have invested into different projects of ADB's operations. So there's, for example, a waste to energy project in the Maldives. There's river restoration in China. But for example, we also invested in private sector projects for plastics recycling. On this chart, I just wanted to show a normal process for a bond issuance. So it's not totally in line with what you heard from Herman and Beverly earlier, because this is now, as also ADB issued, it's a bond where you account for the money that you received into which projects you actually invested. So about 90% of the bond market uses this process of use of proceeds, while, for example, what Herman described, it's a sustainability linked project where the government makes a promise, as he explained, these two promises to investors that they would achieve. And if you achieve them, you pay a lower coupon on your bond. And if you don't achieve them, you have to pay a higher coupon. In this model, you actually show to your investors which projects you funded with their money. So first of all, I mean, also as Herman showed, you have to engage all relevant stakeholders. That's the same in ADB. So for example, we have to engage operations, what they think is the reliable pipeline. We have to engage Treasury, of course, that would issue such a blue bond, and then colleagues in our sustainable development team. And the same applies to governments, as Herman explained, and also corporates. For example, we are also advising corporate clients, where then Treasury is now engaging with senior management, but also all their frontliners, and bringing everybody together, which wouldn't be normal. In a usual Treasury operation, they just do the refinancing and they do not care so much about what actually happens with the money. And that's a very important step if you issue such a thematic bond, that everybody has to come together and stand behind this common goal. Then based on these discussions, you would write your bond framework. That's something you publish and that you show to investors, but also all your stakeholders, what you want to do with this money, how you would report on what you do with it. And then in the next step, you would identify relevant budget items. So that could be sometimes already something you finance. So usually investors would allow you to also refinance something that you already did finance in the last 1 to 2 years. But of course, also mainly forward-looking what you want to finance. Then you ask for a second party opinion provider that they give you this stamp of approval, or sometimes you also have to alter parts of your bond framework if they think that there's not sufficient strength to some of the things you propose. And then you can actually go to the market and issue your blue bond. And after issuance, you still keep very engaged with your investors. You do not only have to pay interest and repay their principal, but you would also monitor and report on what you did with the money and what you achieved. So for example, in green bonds, you often show how much greenhouse gases you actually saved with the money. And in blue bonds, that of course depends on which areas you invest in. You would also report on these targets that you wanted to achieve. And you would also show all the projects that you've invested in. And then of course, step 7 would be to repeat this process. And since this is quite complicated, ADB set up the Blue Bond Incubator that was mentioned earlier. And the job of our Blue Bond Incubator, I mean, one is of course research and development to see how can we strengthen the blue bond market in general. Then a second task is to show global guidance, because up to now, while there's very clear guidance for green bonds, there's no such guidance yet that is globally acknowledged for blue bonds. So we're working on that. And then we have specific TA programs to help either countries issue blue bonds or corporate clients of ADB to issue blue bonds. So if we move to research and development, and also considering time, I mean, Herman already made a great job of showing all the advantages of blue bonds, the credibility it gives your country about the claims you have, for example, about your sustainability goals, and you see long-term financing opportunities, the greenium that was mentioned, the increased interaction between government agency. But there are also barriers that we notice. One, the standardized guidelines, that are still missing. Then there is lack of liquidity, and in a very specific sense. So we find that there are a lot of investors out there that want to invest in blue bonds, but often they only start to get interested if your bond issuance is above $100 million, while many of our clients at ADB, especially if we look at Pacific countries, rather look at issuances of 20 to 30 million. So there's a real mismatch with liquidity. Then sometimes it's also about credit worthiness. So many of the countries that would be relevant to issue a blue bond are also hard hit by climate change and natural catastrophes. So that's something we are looking at, how to improve credit worthiness. Then, of course, there are many countries that have never issued such a thematic bond and definitely no blue bond yet. How can we support the expertise to do that? And last of all, it's of course also you need the bankable projects that could be refinanced from this blue bond. And so you need a good, strong pipeline. Then the other topic that I mentioned, the guidance. And so hopefully in June, we will now issue this guidance. We work together with the UNEP FI program, with ICMA, that's an association based in Paris that also issued all the relevant bond principles, for example, for green bonds, for sustainability linked bonds, and further. Then we also have the United Nations Global Compact on board to also reach out to the private sector. And last but not least, the World Bank Group represented through IFC. And all of us, we come together and plan to issue this global guidance document now in June that will show what we would advise as sensible investment areas in a blue bond. Then on this slide, it's just to show the different services that we as ADB can offer to a country that wants to issue a blue bond. We can, of course, do more general trainings and outreach. And then we also have very specific services that can help with deciding which bond option is best for the country. For example, is it use of proceeds or such a sustainability-linked bond with KPIs as Erman explained. We can help setting up the bond framework, identify the assets. We also would help reaching out to investors and making this link between interested investors and countries that want to issue. And then, as mentioned, we also have different opportunities to de-risk the issue. And on a case-by-case basis, ADB can also give a guarantee for a bond that a member country wants to issue. And we have similar offerings on the private sector side, so for private clients of ADB. And this is also possible in all member countries of ADB. And we are currently working specifically with two companies, one or it's a bank in the Philippines and another company in China, which would be the first blue bond for each of them. And for one of them, even the first bond they would ever issue. And here I just wanted to show briefly the eligible categories that in this standardized document that we are bringing out with the other organizations as mentioned. So there are 7 areas. Of course, I mean, if you want to issue a blue bond, you do not have to cater to all of these 7 areas. But I mean, there are some that also would not be covered under a green bond or principles, or you wouldn't necessarily find it very reasonable by looking at the green bond principles that you also could do this. It's, for example, ecosystem management, it's coastal climate adaptation, and these things are now included in this guidance document and will help new issuers. And then, of course, countries probably will pick 3, 4, 5 of these categories that are relevant in their bond framework. Similarly, ADB did, but for example, corporate clients that we are advising, depending on their business, like one of them, for example, would only choose one category that is sustainable seafood or sustainable marine value chains, as it's called here. And I see I only have 10 seconds left. I mean, this was just one brief attempt to show what could be relevant investment areas here in Sri Lanka. But of course, there are also other opportunities, as mentioned, for example, on renewable energy. And then let me just close with the last slide that also shows some of the future areas we are working on. So one is to help with the repayments of bonds. We want to look at new revenue streams, both from blue carbon, that is heavily debated at the moment, and also in future biodiversity credits. Then we are looking at options to pool bonds in a special purpose vehicle. So that would be relevant. As I mentioned, that many investors, they only look at bigger issuances, but for example, SMEs or some smaller countries would only want to issue small bonds, and we are looking at how we could maybe pool them. And the last one is debt for nature swaps, as Beverly explained, and we are also working on that in ADB. So currently we are discussing with 2 countries to structure a similar structure as you've seen in Beverly's presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas, and thanks for ending your presentation in a timely way. I think we have run out of time, and we'll probably be encroaching on the next session if we continue. So let me close the session. I would again like to thank all the panelists for taking out the time and joining us, providing us with their words of wisdom, and more importantly, potentially triggering off, healthy discussions on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Iyer, Mr. Thurman, and all speakers who joined with us virtually. Next up, for the discussion on the presentations that we have been listening to, let me have the honor of inviting Professor Buddhi Marabe, Senior Professor, Faculty of Agriculture, University of Peradeniya, Sri Lanka, to moderate the session. I would also like to invite Mr. Song to join the head table to join the discussion. Let me remind you all to post your questions on the digital platform using the QR code or the link provided in the Zoom chat and contribute to the discussion. Thank you.
Good day to everyone, and thank you very much, ADB, for opting for me to moderate this session. We need one presenter who was there earlier on stage. Okay, right. Thank you very much. We do understand the externalities that comes in. Well, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, a very important subject, natural capital, something that we have been discussing a lot in the past. But here comes a scenario where natural capital assessment, valuation has come into picture, which is extremely important. And when you look at the previous presentations that were made, we gain rich experience from Belize, from China, and from Uruguay, and also the ADB experience coming into picture. Please do keep in mind, all efforts that are made today are in relevance to Sri Lanka. If you look at the title, we are looking at sustainable development and in a climate change scenario. In other words, we are talking about climate resilience and looking at Sri Lanka. So that's why all these experiences are becoming important. But Chancellor, as academia, we are always talking about experiential learning and about the importance of that. Although it has a different connotation, what we experience today are the learning experiences coming from other countries. If at all, we have to move forward on this particular pathway. So that's the important thing. And as the compere mentioned, as Ushena mentioned a little while ago, there's a QR code, a big QR code being given in the 2-page flyer that you received today morning. So please make sure that you scan it and you put forward your questions, and those questions will land on my screen. That's the most important part. And then I'll be in a position to direct the questions to different partners who are here right now. Before I start, I know I've eaten into 2 minutes right now. So before I start, I must tell you the topic of natural capital management. I'm really glad ADB's intervention at this particular stage on this particular subject. The important point is that there are many parties working on the natural capital management in Sri Lanka and outside as well. And what we are going to get, the experience that we are going to get in the next session is basically on those. But I must also tell you that there's another movement going on where Sri Lanka, Japan, and UK have set up a joint consortium also to look at natural capital management. I'm sure from Sri Lanka, I am the partner, and I'm sure my colleagues, the partner organizations, are now joining online to this occasion as well. So we can share experiences, and I'm sure on a given date in the future, there should be harmonization of all these activities if we are to move forward. Okay, so to get the ball rolling, I think, let me ask the first question from the chair as the moderator. I would like to turn to Uruguay, where there was a very interesting presentation that was done, and there were a lot of learning points that we had, especially focusing on Sri Lanka. But I would like to ask from Uruguay's experience about the challenges that they faced at the very beginning in coming up with this type of a move. So over to you, Uruguay, and we would like to hear from you about the challenges, because we know every challenge can be converted into an opportunity to find a solution. So if you can talk about 2 to 3 important points that you faced and you think as challenges to implement such a scenario in Uruguay. Over to you. I hope our speaker from Uruguay can hear us well at this stage. Okay, there are certain hitches and glitches we do understand when the technology comes into effect. So let me turn back to my colleague who is seated next to me, who brought in some very useful information with respect to ADB's experiences. You're talking about future, and of course, say how ADB can intervene and assist or be a catalyst, for example, in such as in Sri Lanka. What opportunities that are available, for example? Okay, right now, ADB is joining hands with one of the leading universities in the country and probably in the world as well, University of Paradena. And looking at the scenario, the environment at University of Paradena as well, what interventions can be there from ADB's part for future, especially in investing in natural capital? Over to you.
Right, so I think, and that's why I think that this whole conference today is very useful, that there's this link between the financing mechanisms and then also the research on natural capital and relevant projects, because as I also mentioned earlier, that this is of course paramount, that you have this pipeline of projects that you actually want to finance, and you have a good reasoning why these are relevant projects, because you will have to defend them in front of your investors, but also all the stakeholders, because these documents will be public, they will be looked at by NGOs all over the world, and so you will get a lot of feedback and either praise or criticism. So I think if we do this cooperation well between ADB and your university in Sri Lanka, we can find a good pool of projects that could be financed, and this work could also be very useful, even if one doesn't go for such a use of proceeds bond, but for a bond like Erman mentioned earlier, for these KPIs, these key performance indicators that you would have in such a sustainability-linked bond, there you also need a very good baseline over the last few years, what was actually the status quo, and then what did you achieve then over the life of the bond to better protect forest or the marine ecosystems or whatever, and there all your work will be very useful, I think.
Thank you very much. Since I see our speaker from Uruguay is online, over to you once again. To repeat the question, would like to know what challenges that you face at the very beginning, coming up with these novel ideas to put forward to the society and make sure they are implemented. If you can listen and hear about 2 to 3 such key challenges that you faced and how you overcome it, that will be a very good learning experience for Sri Lanka. Over to you. You are muted at this.
Thank you for the question. And sorry for, I'm seeing myself twice. Maybe I'm connected through 2 different. So,
we hear you and see you, yeah.
all right. So yeah. Well, I would say that the first challenge that we found when we thought about first in thinking about why did we go the route of using a sustainability-linked bond rather than, for example, a use of proceeds, as was discussed previously. I would say there are two basic reasons. The first one is we were really convinced that having a performance base focusing on outcomes was very important for signaling the country's sustainability commitments. So we like this idea of committing to, of promising and driving action towards certain goals, clear goals with a predefined timeline, would help become a commitment device to align the whole nation behind this idea of sustainability. And the second reason why we thought we would go with a sustainability-linked bond is because it overcomes the hurdle that sometimes faces small countries like Uruguay face of having enough pipeline of projects where to earmark the resources of such a big global bond transaction. So given that we decided to go with a sustainability-linked bond for those two reasons, the first challenge that we had encountered was to say we had to think of indicators to embed inside the bond, KPIs, that had to meet several conditions. They have to be relevant to the sustainability objectives of the country. They had to be comparable across countries because investors would be comparing them, assessing them in relative terms. They had to have a methodology that was shared internationally. They had to be reported at a relatively high frequency. And also we had to have already targets that were already set for those indicators. So as you can see, there were a lot of conditions, and there are very few macroeconomic indicators that actually would meet all those requirements. Unfortunately, it occurred to us that we could use the NDCs of our country, of the Paris Agreement, as KPIs for a sovereign bond. And I think it fits very nicely the condition of what a KPI is. But let me highlight one thing that investors in particular thought it was interesting, is that the KPIs and the SPTs that we used in the bond that we issued in 2022 were set back in 2017, when Uruguay issued submitted its first NDC to the Paris Agreement. So they were set under the previous administration. And when they were set back then, nobody were discussing about the possibility of embedding them inside a bond. So they were completely exogenous to the decision to issue a bond. And now they were embedded in this administration, but by 2025, when the targets come to fruition, it would be another administration that would be at the time in Uruguay. So there is a policy continuity across administration. That was something that we value. So choosing the KPIs right and thinking of the design was one important challenge. The second one, as I said, was on the possibility of a step down. You know, being creative is about thinking new ideas, but innovating really is about taking them to practice. And when we were trying to innovate, we felt that pushback, that very strong pushback from investors, that they were not willing to accept to buy a bond that had the chance of reducing the coupon if the country overperforms on environmental commitments. And again, something that would sound reasonable for many of you in the audience, fair, with a fair distribution of risks. The status quo was there were 320 SLBs issued since 2019, and none of them had a step down feature. All of them had a step up feature. So imagine that for us, it took, I would say, almost a year and a half to convince investors to walk the talk, to really say, okay, you really care about the environment, you really care about global public goods, then here is a financial instrument aligned with the Paris Agreement, so you can reveal your preferences. So I would say that second issue designing the step-down feature and getting it accepted by the market was a big challenge. And the third one was in putting together the whole cross-ministerial, interministerial strategy, reporting mechanisms to start reporting greenhouse gas emissions every year instead of every 2 years, setting up, innovating with United Nations Development Program. It really takes a lot of effort, a lot of coordination, and sometimes, as an anecdote, you can get lost in translation. Because imagine we've always issued plain vanilla global bonds, and this was always designed within the Ministry of Finance of Uruguay. We never had to interact with the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Agriculture and Cattle Raising, let alone the Ministry of Industry and Energy. But all of a sudden, it was 4 ministries around the table trying to design a bond. And sometimes we were talking about financial markets, they were talking about climate change, and sometimes you could get lost in translation. But in the end, the big thing, as I was saying in my presentation, you start finding sustainable champions in other ministries, you harmonize your communications, and you get a bigger push for the idea of sustainability as a commitment device. So I would say, I would highlight those as the big challenges, but it was worth the effort.
Thank you very much. There are 2 questions that have been posted by the audience, one for Professor Wade. So let me read the question here. Do you see potential for a country like Sri Lanka to go down the same way as Belize when it comes to Sri Lanka's debt restructuring and linking it to natural capital objectives? Unfortunately, Professor Wade is not available online right now. So I think she did mention that Sri Lanka has the potential in this particular aspect. And she also highlighted several necessary conditions which are also applicable to Sri Lanka in her presentation. For example, having a substantial conservation agenda and having a significant debt burden, and all those things will have to be taken into account when you try to address these issues. And another question has come up to Mr. Ouyang from China. And the question reads like this: could you please elaborate more on how GEF or GEP, has linked with market mechanisms to manage ecosystem services? I was also told that Professor Ouyang had to leave, so we will definitely respond to this question and get back to you. And what we really want is to the member who asked this question to post the email address of the member so that the organizers can address this question later. Andreas, there's a question for you. Comparing blue bonds with traditional bonds, what would you consider are the major differences between the two, and the positives and negatives?
Thank you. So, I mean, that's a big question, but so
there's limited time though.
Yeah, limited time. I can see that.
Yeah.
So I think some of the big advantages, I mean, as we also again heard from Erman, I think that this really allows government or any organization to come together over the different departments and everybody line up behind the sustainability agenda, so that you really have a Ministry of Finance that links up with the Ministry of Environment on a common goal through this bond issuance. I think that that's a great plus and very important. Then in some bonds, we could show this greenium, as it is called sometimes. So this is that in some of these bond issuance, you have much more demand from investors than you would have in a plain vanilla bond. So if you didn't do a thematic bond, there would be less interest from investors, and because there's oversubscription and you have more investors, this would bring down the interest rate you have to pay on your bonds. So I mean, this cannot be guaranteed, of course, but there is the opportunity. That's another big advantage. And then I think it just shows to the worldwide community, of course, whatever you want to send out, how serious you are about your sustainability agenda. So for example, example, we have some countries in the Pacific who are very eager to issue a blue bond to show how much they care about the oceans and the marine environment, also as a goal actually to do PR for the tourism sector, because this gets picked up in media and it just shows how serious they are about conservation. But then, because there was also the question about the downside, of course, I mean, many of these things come with additional tasks. I mean, for example, when you want to bring together all these different government departments, this needs more time than if a Ministry of Finance would, of course, just issue a bond as they used to do. So maybe I keep it at that.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Well, we have the keynote speaker with us right now at the head table. It's a rare chance that we get to ask a question from a keynote speaker, but I would like to forward the same question that was asked by the audience from Mr. Wei from China. So would you like to take it?
Yeah, I would like to take that question because this is economics. Yeah. Economists usually value would like to through the market price, because market price can show the repeated transactions, which would show the value. People would review their preferences for that particular goods and service, then put a price tag on it. But unfortunately, for many natural assets, ecosystem goods and services, there's no market. You cannot trade. There's no such a trading. Then the economists usually have a way, actually we do have a way to value them. One way is we do surveys. So we would ask consumers, how much are you willing to pay such a service? Yeah. So you would ask, since this Royal Botanic Garden, you do have a gate ticket. Yeah, only cost 100 rupees for locals. I pay 2,000, but it's okay. Actually, I'm very certified because we come here, we enjoy the recreation value, we enjoy the spiritual values of the Royal Botanic Garden. So you can do surveys, ask people, how much are you willing to pay to see Royal Botanic Garden? Then you ask many people. Then you can get it. Then you try to use the economic techniques. You can put a value on the value of the Royal Botanic Garden. But this is only recreation, no purposes. Another way to measure is what damage you can avoid because of this. Yeah, ecosystem provides a lot of services, like sediment retention. If you have a forest, you retain the soil, and then the sediment retention is a service of the ecosystem. Then this service, if you have a dam, you have a reservoir for that dam. Without such a service, then the dam would accumulate sediment. Then the dam cannot generate hydropower. So that damage, you can transfer that damage as a benefit, as a service of this sediment retention, or carbon absorption, carbon sequestration. All this you can. So it's a possible. So we need to make efforts. Unfortunately, somehow human beings didn't make efforts. If we don't know, we just forget them because we don't know how to measure. So we forget about it. We take it as a constant, no change. But increasingly, we cannot forget them. So we need to make efforts to value them. That's an initial step. Then after valuing, then we can debate. Then gradually through those repeated consultation transactions, or in terms of transactions, you can put a value on them.
Thank you very much, Lele. I don't mind if you're taking another question. I'm sure you don't mind. Right? Yeah.
That's my job.
This question is on data-driven management. So I think this question was forwarded first, but I was thinking to whom this question should be directed at. Since you're there right now, hope you're the best person. How do you think Sri Lanka should invest on data-driven management and digital infrastructure, given that a key step to have a plan on investing on nature?
This is extremely important, as I think, yeah, he probably, this audience listened to my remarks, because I said the first point is you have to understand the status of the nature. When we say understand the status and the measure, basically those are all data. You have to get the data. So how much native forest do you have? You may call it nature forest, but I think there's a distinction between the nature forest and the native forest. The Sri Lanka nature forest, I think there was a debate on the newspaper. I saw that debate. Some people said, oh, Sri Lanka has got so little. You lose so much nature forest. Then the government came out, no, our number shows 30% coverage. So don't worry too much. So these are all data. We need the data. And then we need, actually now the modern technology give tools, instruments to measure. Yeah, you have satellite images. You can measure forest coverage, and you are able to measure. Probably I think you can distinguish native, nature, or just a plantation green coverage. It's possible. I'm not a scientist. I think you guys have a ways. Stanford Natural Capital Project, they have a ways to understand, and then they even have a modeling tools to understand all this natural capital stock, how much services you can flow from those natural capital. I'm not saying I cannot say Raphael would tell you more in the next. So data, you need to build the data, then you need to have a data system. And so hopefully the data can be utilized by everybody. Then it will influence decision making. Yeah.
Thank you very much once again. I'm going back to Uruguay at this stage with another question with respect to private investments or private sector participation in your efforts. I heard that you are mentioning about the investments coming from different angles. But would you like to let us know how enthusiastic the private sector in terms of Uruguay, when it comes to your own experience, in joining hands with the government's initiatives on this particular aspect? Over to you.
Thank you for the question. It is an important one because the goals that were set for the Paris Agreement and embedded in the bond, they are actually not a government's goals, but it's the nations, it's the countries as a whole. And they're the private sector, and the behavior and economic decisions of the private sector are key if we are to attain those goals by 2025. And here I have 2 points to make. The first one is whenever a government, the public sector, takes the lead and breaks into the market with a financial instrument like a sustainability-linked bond, aside from all the goals that we had in mind when we did it, and I reviewed in my presentation, there's also a demonstration effect. What you want to do is to have spillover of these initiatives into the private sector, to send a signal that if the government is concerned about it, is worried, is committed, then it's also up to the private sector to take the lead and mobilize resources to attain those goals. So for example, in the case of Uruguay, we are currently working on a green taxonomy to trying to identify specifically those areas in reducing CO2, methane emissions, and oxidonitrous that would help us attain the Paris Agreement goals. And we're also engaging the financial system and in trying to mobilize resources towards those sectors. So I would say that the message is resonating with the private sector, and we have seen a lot of interest, a lot of questions, and people business trying to incorporate this notion of sustainability as performance-based objectives. Now, we have a very ambitious target and a very ambitious deadline ahead of us. We are not talking about the 2030 or 20 years from now. Is 2 years from now. It's 2025. That's what our NDC, first NDC, has said. So we had a lot of effort. We need to devote the resources. And from the point of view of the government, we are introducing new tax incentives, something I didn't mention, but in our budget law last year, we introduced new tax incentives for landowners to encourage them to protect and restore the native forest. Maybe one difference between Uruguay and Sri Lanka, and I really don't know much about Sri Lanka, the country as a whole, but I would say that something that is unique about Uruguay is that 97% of the area that is occupied by native forests in Uruguay is private property. It's not part of the government. So that's even more challenging because you have to work in the incentives. And that's again where we think the power of finance comes in. The power of finance is not only about connecting the supply and demand of capital, but also is about changing behavior through incentives. And that's what we're trying to do with the bond in Uruguay.
Thank you very much. Herman, there's another question for you, if you can answer in 2 minutes max. This is a question, I will read it loud and fast. You mentioned that it has been 1 year since issuing the sustainability linked bond. Are there some things you would have done differently?
Okay, I will answer very quickly, like putting at ×2, like we do in WhatsApp to listen to the audios. So what we would have done differently, that's a good question. I think when we issued the bond, we tried to coordinate with all ministries, to put together the policies to make sure that we maximizes the chances to reach those goals by 2025. One thing to bear in mind is that the first indicator, greenhouse gas emissions, is expressed as an intensity measure, as a share of real GDP. And because of the pandemic, there was a big contraction in economic activity in Uruguay, as in many other countries. So that ratio actually increased, not so much because of the emissions itself, but because of the contraction in real GDP. I wouldn't say we would have done something different, but it's something that we mentioned to investors, that there was this impact coming from GDP. Probably there are things that we could have improved upon. I cannot think of them right now, but to the person that asked me the question, I would be glad to engage. And if I remember other things, particularly if we could share practical lessons with other countries on what we could have done better, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you very much, Herman, and thank you very much the panelists who have joined this session, especially during the discussion, for your active participation, and especially the members in the audience for putting forward very interesting questions, challenging questions, I must tell you, so that our panelists were able to answer with a lot of thinking coming into it. That's the important part for future as well. So thank you very much, Herman, especially to you for staying with us despite the time difference. I know it's about 3 o'clock in the morning and keeping awake with us, and that's a difficult task, and that itself shows the dedication and commitment that you have had on this particular subject. And thank you very much for all the participants once again for actively taking part in this discussion. Thank you, Andreas Lele, and despite being a keynote speaker, was always ready to respond to the questions that we had. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Marape, Mr. Son, and all the speakers who joined the discussion and all who raised the questions. And with that, we will be concluding the morning session. I would like to invite the in-person invitees and attendees to join with us for the lunch. Our team and the usherers will be guiding you to the lunch area. I would like to request our virtual audience to join us again at 1:05 p.m. Colombo time, which is 3:35 p.m. Manila, to participate in the rest of the program. Thank you.